Okay, everybody, so today we're going to get into the rise of Christianity, which would see just an unparalleled run of power and strength. And again, if we remember, I have here from nothing to everything, going from a persecuted sect to adoption by an emperor to really the complete heights. Okay, so once again, we recap. We remember that it started small after the death of Jesus, if we look over here, just around Jerusalem. And then St. Paul rolls in and starts to um, travel around, and he's spreading the religion. And you see all the crosses where you have either the red ones where you have monasteries, or the black ones where you have the major churches. And then, of course, Constantine adopts the religion and fosters and looks to expand the religion. And then Rome falls, and this is going to be very important. Now, if you look at the fall of Rome, which isn't too far after 325 BC or AD, really about around the year 400, Christianity wasn't in a lot of places. But by the year 600, in the supposed Dark Ages, look at how far it spreads, and this is pretty impressive. So the question is, how were they able to do it? And they would actually spread even more because they're going to pull in Russia and Sweden and Norway and then a little bit of Finland over here. The missionaries. This was crucial. What made Christianity so successful really does have to do with the missionaries that started with St. Paul and then were expanded under Constantine. And the people that they chose, if you look at these missionaries, were they all good? Of course, they're not all good people. We hear some stories that are a little sketchy in places, but what you have here is, for the most part, they're devout, they're passionate, they love their religion, and many of them were willing to risk their lives, and many indeed were killed trying to spread this faith. That the barbarian groups didn't like it and killed some of them. So it really was remarkable. And the tactics that they used was really to focus on the message of God, keeping it simple, keeping the idea of how Christianity is indeed for everyone. And what they also very intelligently did, as I mentioned in the last video, is they focused on the upper class in the idea of getting the nobility, getting kings to convert. And when that happened, the kings would often kind of tell their people they were converting. But if the king converts, then they're going to convert. And it was tremendously, tremendously successful. What also helped them was the power that they wielded. Simply this: after Rome fell, and then after guys like Charlemagne, there was only one thing that could fill that vacuum of power, and in the end, it was Christianity. And what they had was a series of popes that were incredibly powerful, and the guy that really led it was Pope Gregory the First, also known as Gregory the Great. He was the pope from the year 540 to 604. He was actually a bit of a conqueror, in that his forces would create what would be known as the Papal States. So the Pope actually controlled much of central Italy for a significant amount of time. And what he really expanded upon this idea, and people had kind of floated it prior, was that the Pope, as the successor of Peter, was God's representative on earth. And in many ways, that they were infallible and that they were here to lead all people in the message of Jesus and were all powerful as a result of that. And that is tremendously impactful. And that puts these guys at a position that no other person really in history has ever really held. Now, Gregory was also big on really focusing on strict penance, that when people went to confession, that they would be given real penances. Much of the modern day Mass, if any of you have ever been to a Catholic Mass, and really with the Catholic Mass, a lot of the other types of Christian groups, their masses are really based off of the advances of Gregory, so he set that up. He also was really big on missionaries and getting people out there. Um, And then, most importantly, was his focus on the poor. And this is what starts to drive a lot of people in it. During the Dark Ages, there would be a lot of poor, and there were many Catholic churches that would do all they could to support the poor and get them food and just do tremendous amounts of things for them. If you actually look at the current Pope today, that's kind of his big message and his big goal is to help the poor. And so you have this phenomenal leader in Gregory, and then you would have these other popes that would have that power and that ability to wield it and have these guys as strong leaders who were ready to kind of take things over. Now, the church was also really huge in that I have here the role of the clergy. And if you look over here, you do have two different types of clergy. You have the Pope at the top, and then you had cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and priests, and then you had monks and nuns. And these people don't really work with others inherently. They really kind of keep to themselves, but they'll also do a lot of different work for the poor and others. But the key thing was that the clergy controlled the sacraments, they controlled the Mass, and if you wanted to go to heaven, you had to go through them. What also helped them was that the church would become tremendously wealthy. In the Bible, it talks about giving up 1/10 of your wealth, if you will, to the church. Well, in the end, that ends up being quite a bit of money, in that all people and kings and governments would be required to give up 1/10 of their wealth to the church. The church also was not taxed. So they got all this money, then they would buy land and they had rents. And so effectively, the Pope would become the richest man in all of Europe. Now, you also have the development of monks and nuns who would do a lot of work. The really first group of monks ever founded were founded by Saint Benedict, who created what was called the Rule, and the idea of a Christian monk will live apart in monasteries. They are under complete control of the abbot. And what they really do is three basic things: poverty, chastity, and obedience. That they live in basic, humble abodes, that they are chaste, they are not to marry, which eventually would spread to the priests, that they obey the abbots. An abbot is the guy in charge of the monastery. But then they would do farming, they would help the poor, and their impact was huge. Now, it was really tough to be a monk. Just to give you an idea, Benedict was so strict that he actually had a number of his monks actually try to kill him. They were unsuccessful, but this guy had, he was really, really strict. But you had two things. These monasteries often doubled as schools, and if you look on the right there, that is actually Saint Benedict's own monastery that he created in central Italy, in Nursia. And these guys were preservers of knowledge. When I get back to the Renaissance, it was these monks that would actually track down books and copy them and write biblical sources, and a lot of the knowledge that would end up being used in the Renaissance came from these guys in the monasteries. And in the future, you'd have other groups like the Dominicans and the Franciscans. The Dominicans were best known as being the monks of the Inquisition, so they were a little rough. Franciscans, after St. Francis of Assisi, were very big about being missionaries, and a lot of your big time missionaries were Franciscans. And then eventually you'll get other groups later on. But these monks would be, even though they kind of kept to themselves, these orders would be very impactful, especially later on as we get into European history. Now, the other thing that really gets established is this concept of heresy. And the basic definition of heresy is this is, people who believe in something that deviates from the basic structure of the church. And in order to keep its power, basically, if you spoke out against the church, that was seen as heretical and could get you in quite a bit of trouble, as you see the people on the right there being burned alive. Um, you often had groups like the Waldensians and the Albigensians, The Waldensians were a group of people that felt that the clergy had too much power and started a movement to kind of change it. So they were called heretics, and many of them were killed. The Albigensians, or the Cathars as they were more commonly known as, believed in the concept of dualism, that God kind of had a good and evil side, as well as the idea that Jesus could be construed as being mortal, not divine, and thousands of them were killed in France. There was actually a crusade called against them in the 12 and the 1300s. But this is going to be something that is going to get the church in trouble in the future. In order to try to hold on to their power, the use of violence or the threat of violence will cause some problems. But nonetheless, at this time, this was very impactful, and the church had tremendous amounts of power. The other thing that people often did was going on pilgrimage. The idea that to get closer to the church, that you went to these holy places. You had St. Peter's in Rome, you had all the stuff in Jerusalem, and then you had one of the big ones, which was the Church of Compostela in Spain, which is said to house the remains of St. James, who was one of the 13 disciples. And we have pretty reliable information that he actually did go to Spain and help to convert the people who were there. Um, Really, really influential guy, one of the more popular of the apostles. And this idea of building churches would get really big, and they start to build just these incredible churches. Here you see probably the biggest church that was built at the time. This is Chartres Cathedral in France. This was dedicated to Mary. As you can see, it's absolutely massive. To give you an idea, if you follow the mouse, I got to see this place. I once stood all the way back here and was not able to get the entirety of the front in my picture. As you can see there, that's just one of the entryways, and what's really cool is this is actually a functional church today. Really, really beautiful. On the inside, you have this wonderful stained glass. You can see how huge this church is, just massive. And what's really cool is this picture on the left here is said to be the veil of Mary. It does date to the time of Mary in the 1st century CE. Now, whether or not Mary wore it or not, I don't know, but the fact that it even could, I thought was really cool when I got to visit it. Now, individually, aside from Gregory the Great and a number of other popes, really the big time guy at this point was St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, we talked about Aquinas earlier and his influence being some Muslim scholars, most notably Avicenna. He was an Italian priest, a Dominican priest who lived from 1225 to 1274. He was a theologian and a bit of a philosopher, and he wrote this massive work called Summa Theologica. And the idea of what he wanted to do was to use the concept of rationality and almost science, if you will, to prove the existence of God. That it wasn't necessarily all faith-based, that there are rational things out there that can actually show God and what he does, and that religion can be a rational and forward-thinking thing. And a quote from him is that for knowledge of any truth whatsoever, man needs divine help, that the intellect may be moved by God to its act. So, in many cases, saying that almost scientific thought comes from God, and that God is a conscious agent that set the world in motion, and that there are natural kind of laws out there that you can see come from God. Um, he also wrote on law and science and ethics, and he really pulled everything back to religion. And in a lot of different ways, it's one of kind of your earlier, like, scientific, religion-y type works. And it was tremendously influential. And for a lot of reasons, which was interesting, is that many people looked at this work as something that they even either loved and looked to push forward. For instance, a great example of that would be Isaac Newton. Newton, most of the work he did, he wanted to prove the existence of God, and others who disagreed with him. But in disagreeing with him, it spurred them on to do more work. So here was a guy that was tremendously influential, that not only did his work that was huge as far as religion was concerned and really helped validate a lot of the message of Christianity at that time, but also spurred on others as well. and showed that Christianity could be, in many ways, kind of for everyone. And so, as you can see, during this time period, Christianity tremendously powerful. They're doing a lot of different things, and we're going to be talking about their rise and eventual fall, which will continue to shape Europe for many years to come. All right, get your notes and your comments, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.